Let's bring in our next guest, though. Yasmine Sherif is Executive Director of the UN's Education Cannot Wait, a Learning in Crisis Zones initiative, providing education for child refugees. Yasmine, thanks for joining us. Just back in London, of course, from Chad, where many thousands of Sudanese children are now refugees in urgent need. Tell us about the situation that you saw in Chad.
Well, we went to eastern Chad, along the border, to one of the settlements or reception areas where refugees are arriving straight from Darfur by night, called Borota. And they have gone through a harrowing journey, and they fled for their lives. And they had to flee by night, not to be stopped by the RSF or robbed or killed. Children are deeply traumatized. You could see that they were vigilant and afraid at first as we arrived. It was Education Cannot Wait, together with the High Commissioner for Human Refugees, or the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, together with the Jesuit Refugee Service and UNICEF, who are doing the work on the ground. When we arrived on Wednesday, there were 30,000 who had crossed the border. 2 days later, that amount had doubled to 60,000. 70% of them are children in school age.
70% of the refugees are children. It's a phenomenal amount. As you're talking to us, Yasmine, we're showing images from Fachana and Barota, the places you went to in eastern Chad, to illustrate exactly where you've been. Some people watching this might think that school would be the least urgent matter for these children. Tell us why it's important that school has to be imposed, given that structure. Why is it important?
Well, let me say this, and I used to work in Sudan when the conflict in Darfur broke out in 2004, 2005. The day before, we had been to Gaga area, where a refugee camp of 18 years length of refuge. We met refugees who've been there for 18 years, having fled already back then. And thanks to the fact that they were receiving education, they were today strong, they were healed, and they were becoming teachers, and they were able to move on with their life. The refugees we met the next day, who were arriving within days from Borota, had nothing of that. These kind of crises are usually protracted, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years as a refugee. You're losing generations. So that's number one. Number two, education is both academic learning, but it's also mental health and psychosocial services. And that's the number one that they need, these children. It also provides school meals. It provides them with the hope that they can arise out of that situation. And their parents want their children to have something to look forward to, learning, be healed from their traumas, receive a school meal, water and sanitation. Education is a very broad scope of an intervention that addresses all the needs for a child.
Indeed, and what people watching might not realise is that, and this is something that your team brought out to me when we spoke a little earlier, is that these children are at risk from other things. You will detail these things for me, I know, and they're quite gruesome things that they are at risk from, the risks to their lives. School somehow gives them that sort of bit of safety, that structure of safety that perhaps keeps them out of the reach of people who might mean harm for them.
Absolutely. For the girls, they are exposed. If they're not in school, they're exposed to trafficking, unwanted pregnancies, early child marriages, and other forms of sexual abuse. And the boys are very much exposed to being forcibly drafted into armed groups. And as we know, Chad is surrounded by neighboring countries that are plagued by armed groups. So the school becomes a protective environment to keep them away from all those dangers while they are also healing and building the skills for life.
And Yasmine, you've announced a $3 million grant to help the UNHCR set emergency schools. In a society where that would be what, say, a top footballer might get paid for a couple of weeks' work, it does seem like a small amount of money, and it seems immoral that there's so much money swishing around in other parts, but you've got this small amount to give to help these children. But nonetheless, it's the start of a process.
Well, this is a particular emergency response. The grand total of what is required for Eastern Chad's education to the refugees is $8 million, according to the refugee response plan for the region that has been developed together with several UN agencies and civil society and governments in the region. 8 million for Eastern Chad, about 10 million or more for Egypt, 2 million for Central African Republic. The total amount required is $24.5 million for the 5 countries receiving refugees. However, education cannot wait. We provide catalytic funding, and we use that to draw other contributors, private sector, and governments to come in and top up so that we can meet all the $24.5 million required for the region. Also, when the floods took place recently in Chad, we provided another $2 million. We have also invested, the total amount we have invested in Chad's education system for marginalized is now at $41 million. But as you said, much more is needed. We need to fill the gap for Chad, for Egypt, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, and South Sudan, which is estimated at about $25 million.
Indeed, we're talking like 200,000 people fleeing the country so far, and of course that figure increases each day. 700,000 internally displaced, and again, the majority will be young people, will be children, those in need of education. You must feel you can't help everybody, because clearly what you're doing is in Chad. You can't go into Sudan and create the same structure, can you?
No, we can. And as a matter of fact, I will be traveling soon to South Sudan, and my colleague will be traveling to Central African Republic. So we will try to help all the 5 refugee hosting countries to cope with this influx of refugees who are fleeing for their lives. And with that, the organizations on the ground, the Refugee Agency of the United Nations being the main one, UNICEF another one, and many local organizations and international civil society like the Jesuit Refugee Service, Norwegian Refugee Council, International Rescue Committee, and many others. This funding goes to them who are on the ground, who literally sleep with the refugees. When we were in Bogotá, staff of the UN agency were sleeping with them in the camp. To ensure that they had the essentials that they needed for their survival.
So it needs very special people. Teachers are always said to be very special people, but these are especially special people who are doing this.
Well, the teachers are key, and part of this contribution is, of course, to train teachers, and not only that, to pay the teachers. So many of them are teaching without receiving any salaries because it doesn't exist. But my colleagues on the ground in the different UN agencies and civil society, yes, very strong and committed and passionate people. And of course, we wish that everyone would join that force of compassion and empathy and contribute with resources. Private sector, governments, the world needs you.
Maybe I can't get you to comment on the actual war that's happening, but I'm going to put the question and see what you say. We heard people in our report who basically want this to end straight away. Clearly, this is an internal conflict between the military junta and the rebels emanating out of Darfur. Do you have any sense about how this will go? Because obviously, the further this goes, the more children that will need your help.
Absolutely. And I mean, the sad part is that there's been a conflict in Darfur since mid-2000, 2004, 2005. That's when it started. And so that has been going on for 18 years already. And we know from experience that most conflicts end up being protracted. We speak Syria, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, across the Sahel. So it's not getting any better. However, there has been an agreement now on at least to respect civilians and then to have a ceasefire and eventually peace settlement. The declaration of commitment to protect civilians is a step forward. We should be in accordance with international humanitarian law. But of course, peace is what Sudan and the neighbors need. I cannot foresee what the future will say, but our experience shows that this is usually protracted. We need to focus on the civilian population, and especially the children and adolescents, because they are the future.
Indeed. Yasmine, we'll cross our fingers for that truce because so far it hasn't been coming, even though it's been announced many times. Yasmine Sherif, thank you for your time. Thank you for telling us about your work, which is essential. Yasmine Sherif, Executive Director of the UN's Education Cannot Wait agency, which is a Learning in Crisis Zones initiative. And Yasmine, as I said earlier, has just returned from Chad, joining us from London. And in Chad, of course, her unit setting up schooling for Sudanese child refugees.